I'm just going to raise another question out. Obviously, comes to mind is like, have you thought about what comes before the Haṭhābhyāsapaddhati? Where have you looked at the train that comes up to that point, or made any connections back prior to these two texts?
So the Haṭhābhyāsapaddhati is sitting probably 100 years before the Sri Haṭhābhyāsapaddhati in Maharashtra. So in Maharashtra, where the manuscript was found near Pune. So it's obviously documenting an extraordinary time in history in South India, or Middle India, if you like, where physical asanas were seen as an intrinsic component of Haṭha Yoga. And this is very important because up until this period of time, Haṭha Yoga was mainly static postures which people held for periods of time. They were used to overcome disease, or they were used to prepare someone for pranayama. But all of a sudden, in this extraordinary period of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, you have this, flourishing of asanas, which are moving and dynamic, and they're complex. They're not just simply seated in siddhasana or seated in pranayama or holding, say, Mayurasana for as long as you can. These are really complex sequences, and this is another step forward that we have with the Haṭhābhyāsapaddhati, is that through the study of the Sanskrit, we can show that these it's not just a random collection of asanas listed 1 to 112. There's actually an intelligence to the practice that's been documented, and this is something that actually Jason had to argue quite, against a lot of resistance within academic study of Sanskrit texts, because up until that period, asanas were just described and they're listed, and there's no particular framework about how one practices, how long do they practice, which order do they practice. This sort of information isn't there. And it's not exactly there in the Haṭhābhyāsapaddhati either, but there are, some ways of reading when you see that one posture, for example, doing like an extreme back bend, and then the next posture, it says after doing this posture, an extreme back bend, come into a ball pose. So you come into a ball and you roll your back along the floor. Well, there's no reason to be in the previous posture. So it's not like the previous posture was a condition for the next posture. So Sanskritically, it doesn't make sense, right? So, for example, if you say, take Padmasana, now put your hands through and do Kukutasana, that makes sense, yeah? And someone could argue that they're two separate poses. They can be done independently. The Sanskrit doesn't suggest a sequence. But what we saw in the Haṭhābhyāsapaddhati is that actually one posture is potentially either a counter pose, or there's a reason related that it's there, and it's likely that it's a sequence. So this is an exciting piece of development, if you like.
But it's perhaps, it's maybe the earliest chronicling of some kind of idea of vinyasa then, really, isn't it? Like
the term vinyasa is a little complicated, but it's definitely a sequence.
If we call it a special placement of asanas, to, in some kind of relevant order, in context to each other, it definitely sounds like the first time when we can recognize that there's just not static, as you said.
Yes, so these asanas are moving, absolutely. So this is what's interesting. It says, bring your knee to your chest and then roll it around in a certain direction, or move your arms in a particular way. And so, we're having documented moving postures with the purpose of building bodily strength. So it's an interesting time. And you asked about, do we look a bit earlier? And of course, in different regions of India, and we have a forthcoming essay coming out, which, is looking at 3 different collections around India in this colonial period, if you like, so 18th, 17th, 18th and 19th century, where there are documented evidences of collections of asanas that were being practiced around India. So it's quite an interesting and flourishing time for Hatha Yoga.
So that's prior to the Paddhati you're talking about. These collections are prior to Paddhati. Because what I wanted to ask you then was the obvious question: well, do you have any precedent for the Paddhati? Have you got any leads for tracing this further
No,
back?
it's an extraordinary document in that it in terms of the Haṭhābhyāsapaddhati, it's the first time we're getting something documented like that. No doubt, what we're seeing documented in the Paddhati is a practice that's well developed. So it would have been practiced on the ground by people for a fairly significant period of time. So they're not documenting something new because it takes, as we see, we had to engage very sophisticated and well-learned practitioners to reconstruct it. So it shows that the techniques were well developed. But what we don't have is documentary evidence that predates it in terms of textual history. Of course, we get sort of static kind of, like sculptural images that suggest complex asanas, but interpreting those is quite complex because we don't know. You have to read a lot of history into them because there's no supporting textual evidence. So the Haṭhābhyāsapaddhati is quite extraordinary that way. But what I was trying to suggest is that it's not the only extraordinary collection. There are others in other regional parts of India that are that become influential. They become influential around the 18th and 19th century in India, and they result in texts being written in indigenous languages other than Sanskrit. So we start to see vernacular compendiums written and illustrated, and that results in what we then see in the sort of mid 18th century, all of a sudden books being written in English that have these techniques documented, and that gets transported to the West. So it's an exciting period of history, I think. So it's not just sort of the very early material that we look at, but this period post Hatha Pradipika is really like the flourishing of Hatha Yoga across India. It's pan-Indic, and it's quite an exciting period, and it would have been extraordinary to be there. I wish I could take myself back to that time and just to capture it a little bit. Yeah.
It sounds pretty tough. I don't know, I think you'd better be have your practice game on, pretty on game, if you go back and do those practices. Were they light? And for people that don't know, haven't looked at Norman's book, or was there any kind of similarity to the Ashtanga practices people know today? The series is this a little bit. So is there any relationship?
Absolutely.
Can you describe the differences or the similarities?
So the challenge is, I guess, our tendency is as practitioners to always look for similarities, which is true. So there are similarities, and one particular that I think most people, when we do teach workshops where we reconstruct the asanas and to show people what it's like to do this practice, and most people find it quite exciting that there is something like a downward dog, so Adho Mukha Svanasana, it's not called that, it's called Gajasana. It's like an elephant shape, but it's a posture that's kind of like a downward dog position, and you use that to transition in and out of certain asanas. So there's a whole collection of asanas that you do in and out of that particular shape. So that seems like a fairly clean antecedent, if you like, of something that people would be familiar with in the Mysore traditions of vinyasa.
Absolutely. Yeah, because previous to that, we have to mention that there was no mention of downward dog at all, really. Right?
Yes.
You never saw that posture. So, and it is a linking posture to what we know today in any vinyasa class or Ashtanga class.
Yes.
You don't have downward
and then there's
dog.
Something that's right.
You've no rest.
Sort of the inverted sequence, if you like, of going up into shoulder stand, down into a plow pose, back up into a shoulder position on the shoulders. Well, this is also documented in the Haṭhābhyāsapaddhati, and although it's done probably differently given different names, so this is the challenge, is often the names vary, but the style of moving from a prone position, lifting the legs up, going up to balance on the shoulders, only with the arms up either side of the ears, and then rolling the legs back over to come into a plow version. That's all there. Other things that's quite interesting is, say, in Ashtanga Vinyasa, contemporary Ashtanga Vinyasa, you do, I'm trying to think of what it's called. So you'll have to tell me the name of where you roll back over the, so you Chakrasana, I think it's called, where you...
God, I hope I remember.
Yeah.
You're rolling back over the head into a plank pose.
Chakrasana.
Yes,
well,
Chakrasana, yes. Chakrasana, not
Chakrasana,
Chakrasana.
yeah.
Chakrasana.
So in the Haṭhābhyāsapaddhati, that's there, but it's a transition movement between what's called the supine and the prone position. So you're moving between the supine sequence, so all the postures that are done on the back of the body, to all the postures that are done on the front of the body, and you move from, like a downward dog, and then you roll over the back of the body, and you do a little spin, and you result to come and land on your abdomen, and then that's the place where you start the next sequence. Yeah. So there's quite an when you look at threads, if you like, flavors, there's like the flavors of Ashtanga Vinyasa of Krishnamacharya are most certainly there.
Okay.
But when you, as a historian, if you want to be really precise, you've got to also look at the differences, and there's certainly plenty of those too. And Jason and Mark's article elaborate on some of those. That was published in the Journal of Yoga Studies, and you can have a look at that. But it's, of course, as a practitioner, it's exciting because, yes, you can definitely see the threads of tradition extending through to contemporary practice. And I guess that's one of the challenges, I think, was for members of the royal family of the Mysore Palace, is to explain to people that in the West, Krishnamacharya has sort of been given an honorary title as the kind of extraordinary founder of yoga, or Ashtanga yoga, of the Mysore Palace, and certainly meeting with the Maharani and her family, there was a request to understand that it has a prehistory, that actually that it did exist prior, and that that her father and so forth were patrons of keeping this lineage alive. So it didn't just appear with the success of Westerners meeting and attending Pattabhi Joyce's classes.
That's an interesting point. And you kind of wonder whether he was, when he gained the patronage of the Maharaja at the time, whether he was given certain instructions, given, like, have a look at this text and just access. Kind of, this is the kind of thing that I'm looking for you as a, looking for you to teach, because I mean, Krishnamacharya obviously was mainly a Sanskrit scholar, right? At the time, we know he was taking it, because he didn't want to be a coffee plantation farmer.
He was a very learned man. He was a learned man,
and a good opportunity.
He certainly had access to the Mysore collection. We have evidence for that, and we know that he had seen not only the Sri Tattvanidhi, but I would hypothesize that he's seen images of the Haṭhābhyāsapaddhati. So yes,
he saw the Tattvanidhi. That's interesting.
His own what do you say? Bibliographic information.
Did he put it in the Makaranda? Did he? Right. Okay.
I'm just noticing that my power was running out, but anyway, that's okay.
That's right. Mine is as well. We've got a few minutes. Let's continue till we get cut off. Actually, I mean, I'm always wrapping up here anyway, Jacqueline. I was thinking what you're doing in the luminescent. We haven't really talked about your work in the luminescent, and what I see yours and Jason's role in it was very interesting in terms of kind of bridging kind of very terse and dense academia, as Jason is, I can contest he definitely does well. And bringing some of that stuff, to away, into the field where people can kind of, a lay person, who's not a non-academic like myself and many other practitioners can kind of get the benefit of it. So I suppose I'd like, maybe, as a slight outsider as you are in a way, kind of with a foot in both camps as a practitioner, mainly you call yourself a yoga teacher, I believe, and then a kind of, by default, a kind of academic. How do you see the two camps as relating or kind of, nurturing each other? I mean, I was trying to put together, as you might know, this conference on practice and academia, right? Because we get a lot of comments, for example, on YouTube. I've done things with Edwin Bryant and different, as soon as we put an academic up, people will comment, well, there's nothing to do with yoga. Yoga is about practice. It's, this is just history, right? This is just academia and politics and power. Could you defend maybe what you're doing?
This is an ongoing debate. It's not new, is it? It's like it goes back to the time of the Buddha or even that practice that one can only achieve yoga through practice, and then we get other camps like in the Yoga Bija where they say knowledge is nothing without practice. So you've got to have both. So there's an interesting look. To be honest, it's really a personal choice where you feel that how is my best way to experience this practice of yoga. And I would say that for a lot of people, without the academic study or without the knowledge, you don't know what you're doing, to be honest. Like you can receive knowledge, but it might be it's filtered through your guru perhaps, and your trust in that guru's knowledge. You have to be able to rigorously defend that knowledge if you're going to receive it that way, which is absolutely fine. I'm not questioning that. I'm just saying that we have different ways of learning. And for me, the rigor of academia asks different questions. And these questions are important to understanding the techniques in which we practice today. I would like to actually comment a little before we end, is that I noticed, for example, on your site, you did put up a picture of Pattabhi Jois, who, for me, I want to acknowledge the victims and survivors of Pattabhi Jois, because we are in a situation now where we understand that people were abused by this man, but the knowledge, if we understand history, we can see that the practice extends beyond him, and it can also make us more rigorously question what he did. What is it? What was it? What was he teaching? Was he using the disguise of his position and role in his family and in Mysore to hide his abuses? And we can answer these questions if we rigorously question not only his teachings, but also the history and the area in which he taught and what he taught. And you can't do that clearly unless you have those tools with you. And that's sort of one area where I feel that we can benefit from the academic study. It's also the fact that for a lot of people I've seen in the last 10 or 20 years with the fact that we've been able to get funding for research projects on yoga, because all of a sudden, this wasn't happening before. This is an extraordinary time we're living in, where all of a sudden for 5 years there was a dedicated project that was funded. And this is, may not happen again. It may only, academia lives on a shoestring. People don't realize, they think that they're backed by huge institutions. Well, these institutions are actually under a lot of threat, particularly in the humanities. And most people are living from day to day, not able to pay their rent. So, the privilege that people think that comes with academia is actually a little misunderstood. And I think that, often it's providing a window into the past. And if you want to look there it is. There's someone that spent their life dedicated trying to understand what happened before, and they're opening the window for you to look. But you can also just go to your mat and be a practitioner and just do your practice and see what happens. That's also the case. But you may not know where your practice is coming from. Oh no,
Sounds like a veiled threat.
Like, yeah, I feel I don't have any discouragement for people that want to do that, because I think that's the beauty of yoga. Yeah.
Well, I think having laid out the arguments, against simply just practicing, though, I think for many people, I think it becomes clear that context, and for me, who was in that camp for many years, and latterly through the work of people like, through Luminescent, meeting you online as the Luminescent, and Jason and Jim and other people, where you kind of realize there's a perspective, and great, gaining a larger perspective on the whole thing, as you mentioned with Pattabhi Jois and the scandals around him. You start to see where you fit in, or where or your perspective on things, right? And you start to also be able to differentiate, what you're doing to, and keep what you're doing, and you're able to separate it potentially. Like, we don't really want to get into this whole conversation with Joyce again, but for me, it's one aspect of being able to separate it, in a large trajectory from this particular man and his.
It also enables us to question
Highness,
pedagogy,
behavior,
right?
Naturally.
Question pedagogy. For example,
and asking
we're moving from an age of where corporal punishment was accepted in the 19th and 20th century, and where physical touch was used as abuse, and then we have this continuation of that in a particular lineage, and we now have the tools to really question that, to say it wasn't there before Krishnamacharya and Pattabhi Jois, these adjustments, they weren't there. So do they have value? Would you like to keep them in? What purpose do they serve within my pedagogy? These are questions.
Oh, you just sprang on a whole new podcast. This one, just at the last moment. Well, that's a fantastic question to perhaps end on, and maybe please, anyone that's interested in continuing this discussion, comment, and I would love to hear your opinions on that, because yes, you raised a very, very relevant point, especially for the forthcoming future of Ashtanga yoga, and in the current climate, and with so many problematic versions of gurus and our experience of them, how are we going to go forward in the safest and most therapeutic manner that we can with yoga in general, not just Ashtanga, the yoga in general, and the whole adjustments or assistance these days. So before our batteries completely die, I think I've got a couple of percent, and I don't know what Jacqueline's got. I'm going to say thank you, Jacqueline, for coming on, and we'll put in the notes where you can find Jacqueline, and there's this Luminescent, which I've never really fully got round to saying what it is. So Jacqueline, just give a couple of sentences on what it is, so people can whet people's appetite, as it were, to go and see you on social media and the website.
More than a decade and a bit anniversary, and it really is a conversation, I guess, between academics and practitioners, where we like to provide access to the latest philological research on yoga, and hopefully make some of it accessible, like you've said, Adam, and also challenge some views that people may have on the history of yoga, and then also point people to the latest research, and provide. What we try to do is answer questions that people have about the history of yoga. So things that perhaps you didn't realize had a history, or where did it come from? Like we try to answer those questions. So often our blog posts are spurred on by that.
And it's a fantastic site, and the work that they're doing. Obviously, I didn't mention also the Haṭha Yoga Project, which Jason was involved in, and I'm sure by default, Jackie was also very much involved in, and this, and Jackie mentions this exciting time where, there was all this information and all these texts that are just suddenly in the last years brought to light by things like this Haṭha Yoga Project, with the group of Jason, Jim, and Daniela that I've interviewed, have really done just startling, I'd have to say, use the adjective, work on just the development of our understanding of what this Hatha Yoga is all about, really. So I have to say thank you from everyone again, because as she says, academics don't make a lot of money, and I'm sure you make a lot less money now than you did when you were working for Jet Airways, and it's a sacrifice, and it's a it's really living, a sacrifice and devotion to practice what they're doing. So I think we shouldn't take that lightly, and really, because they're doing, a job for all of us. And I speak for myself and many others to say that it's really liberated and enlightened my own practice, personal practice, infinitely, indescribably. So thank you, Jacqueline, and thank you for coming on.
To talk to you.